If you're a power lifter, is the reverse hyper a possible solution for your back issues? Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. I'm crunched as usual. Tuesdays and Wednesdays are always busy days, so I got to dig right into the Q&A, which comes from my friend Charlie Reed, and Charlie has a really good question. He's been paying very close attention and he is on point. He is asking a follow-up question from last week's Coffee and Coaches conference call where we were talking about lumbar flexion and squatting. And he says, more specifically, I'm curious if you suspect that powerlifters find benefit in the reverse hyperextension exercise because it attempts to create some of the mechanisms that I've described from being able to deep squat, such as counternutation, posterior expansion, stimulating blood flow from the bone above and below the spinal disc, and more favorable cellular adaptations as far as maintaining disc health. So this is actually a really good question because again, there's certainly some elements of powerlifting that are going to challenge maintaining some elements of health, because we're dealing with, if we made a problems list, you got high levels of compressive strategy to lift heavy things, which again, we want to minimize the expansion strategies, because the minute that we release any of our concentric orientation, we're going to accelerate potentially in the wrong direction, which would be downward under most cases. We don't have an effective yielding strategy because we want high levels of stiffness in the tissues. And this is obviously just a byproduct of magnitude of load. You're going to get some spinal compression that's associated with this. So we have compressive strategies throughout, but because of the loss of range of motion that's going to be associated with lifting heavy things, we have to create orientations that are going to allow us to, one, access motions to execute the exercises, and number two, we have to create propulsive strategies into the ground. So we have to produce IR to the ground. So that's going to require some orientation issues, especially with the pelvis, and then we get a lot of that spinal compression. This in turn reduces blood flow to the disc. So the disc is dependent on blood flow from the bone above and below. If we compress the bone, we can actually reduce that blood flow, and then we start to get the degenerative changes in the disc. And so what we have is this one big giant compressive exhalation strategy that is very useful for lifting heavy things. It's fun to do, but there are secondary consequences. And so what we may want to do to restore some measure of health, some measure of movement capability, comfort, such as pain reduction, etc., is we want to try to restore some of these inhalation mechanics that will provide some yielding strategy, improve our ability to turn, so we're not relying on compensatory strategies just to produce normal movement throughout the day. So what we want to look at then is what do these inhalation mechanics look like? So I've got a little representation of a video. It's very subtle, but hopefully you can actually see this. And so what I did is I put Eric prone on the table in the purple room, and I just had him breathe a little bit. And so we actually created a little bit of a compressive strategy on the anterior aspect of the abdomen and pelvis, so you can actually see the expansion posteriorly. And so what we're getting a little bit of sacral counternutation, which is our yielding strategy on that posterior side. So we might be able to acquire this in the reverse hyperextension exercise because of this initial starting position that provides us with an anterior compression that may promote the posterior expansion. And so our mechanics here would be similar to what we might see in the initiation of a toe touch, where we want to see that sacral counternutation and posterior expansion. So again, we're moving somebody from this strong compressive strategy that's going to be in that middle to late propulsive element of propulsion, and we want to move them backwards to early, and this might be a way for us to do this. Now, we've got some issues with this. So the position is favorable, yes, but we also have to deal with load-based issues. So too much load is going to promote a compressive strategy because I need that to lift heavy things. And so I may not be able to access the yielding strategy under those circumstances. So we're going to start with a lighter load for sure to make sure that we can capture the strategy that we're actually shooting for. The second thing is a technical issue. And so when we do these things bilaterally, so anything that's bilateral symmetrical, one's going to create a little bit more of a compressive strategy. It's going to limit our ability to turn. And so one of the things that you'll see with the execution of reverse hyper is the fact that people will sort of exceed the motion capabilities of the hip, and they will start to drive this anterior orientation of the pelvis even in prone. And so you can actually overcome the benefit of the yielding strategy by taking this way too far. And so one of the things you're going to want to try to do is limit the motion to the hip excursion, because by driving the motion through the hip, primarily you're going to promote a little bit of that posterior lower compression, but you might actually capture your sacral nutation under those circumstances. If you drive it farther, you're going to create that anterior orientation. We get the compression of the sacral base, and that's exactly what we don't want to do, because that's what got us here in the first place. The other issue might be velocity, and so you'll see reverse hyper is performed in any number of ways. If we use high velocity, remember that as we apply velocity to viscoelastic tissues, we have a rate-dependent change that might make them stiffer. And again, we won't be able to utilize our yielding strategy, which is the goal under these circumstances. So we're not talking about a performance-related adaptation that we're chasing here. We're talking about recapturing elements of the yielding strategy, which will hopefully promote health, reduce pain, etc. An alternative that you might want to consider then is to use a single leg variation of this. So we take advantage of the prone position, but by driving through a single leg, we can actually maintain a yielding strategy on one side. We create a little bit more of a compressive strategy on the other side, and now we're actually creating a little bit of a turning relationship between the sacrum, and so we can actually capture some of that yielding strategy one side at a time. This is actually one of my favorite ways to do this, especially with your bigger, stronger human beings, because it's just a lot easier to drive compression on one side because they're already compressed on both. We magnify that compression just a little bit, and we actually get the benefit of the yielding strategy on the opposing side. So we'll do this in any number of supine exercises. So we've used supine cross connects and things like that in a couple other videos previously, but when we're talking about the reverse hyper, we're using basically the same strategy by doing it unilaterally. So Charlie, thank you so much for the question. If I didn't answer your question effectively, go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and post another question. I will see you guys tomorrow.